You kind of like the question I wanted to end with here is I think it's really important to even talk about why Jesus had to go to the cross. And we've alluded to it a lot in this conversation. You alluded to it a lot just now in just presenting the gospel to your kids. I mean, if you're wondering, guys, that's what Joel just did is he just presented the gospel to his kids. And when we do that over and over and over again, that's how we, like the Old Testament says, to talk about his word all the time and to write on doorposts. You just did that when you talk to your kids. So there's that encouragement to you guys that are listening. But I think if anyone else is listening and they're like, I don't know about Christianity and it feels real weird that you guys are celebrating the death of someone on a cross. And like, so without this being a whole nother podcast that we could also do, Joel, about this one question, why is it that Jesus had to go to the cross? I mean, this is, like you said, the foundation of our faith. Why did it have to be this way?
Yeah. In Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve, and I always point out that they do it together. Adam and Eve take part of the fruit they're not supposed to take, and they go into full-on rebellion. And that rebellion has stayed with humanity ever since. And every one of us that's like, Adam and Eve, how could they do it? I would have never done it. I'm just gonna be like, nah, you would do it. You would take the apple. Like
we all would.
We would all do it. Like, come on now, right? Like come on. And God is he is bent on having his family together. And so in the first garden, there's these two trees, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and there's also this tree of life. And when God sends Adam and Eve out of Eden, he doesn't do it purely punitively. Is there a consequence? Yes, but that consequence is wrapped up in compassion. And the compassion is, if they ate of that fruit of the tree, they would live in eternal separation from God. And God could not have that. He needed to have a way for humanity to be reconciled back to himself. And the story of scripture from Genesis all the way through to the cross and the gospels is this one continuous story of God working through his people in order to set right all that was wrong. And what is sin? Sin is simply missing the mark. Sin is simply saying like, hey, here's what God intends for us. And sin is like not being able to live up to that, not being able to do that. And so what Jesus does on the cross, a lot of different words that are used for it, but he is our representation. He represents humanity on the cross. He is our substitution. He takes what we deserved. It's called, C.S. Lewis called it the Great Exchange. And he's also the victor, because on the cross, he's victorious over sin and death. And all three of those things, I think, come together so that the gospel, which simply means the good news, could be proclaimed. And what is the good news? The good news is that Jesus didn't stay on that cross. The good news is that Jesus wasn't one in a long line of rebels, leaders that stayed in a grave and their name was etched in a couple, years. No, Jesus rose from the grave. And so because of Jesus' victory over sin and death, the gospel, the proclamation of the good news of who Jesus is something that we can take hold of, that we can grasp, that we can submit ourselves to. And in doing so, we are reunited with God, who is our good Father. And here's the other thing, and this is just a small note. That word gospel, Jamie, in the Greco-Roman world was understood in a military context. And so the victory of Jesus on the cross was the moment where the gospel could truly be proclaimed in fullness. But back then, if a war was won, there would be many other skirmishes that were taking place, and a person would get on their horse and go as fast as they could in order to let everybody else know that are still fighting.
Right.
Hey, the war is over. You don't need to fight anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the cross, that was where that decisive victory took place. And yet, there are still skirmishes that are taking place all over the place. And God has so graciously given us, you and I, this is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, the ministry of reconciliation, that we can proclaim the good news of the gospel, where the presence of all these other skirmishes are taking place, and say, listen, you can stop fighting. There's no more need for that, because Jesus is king and he is victorious.